Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. Friday feeling. Last week, I said I struggled to have a Friday feeling because it was Friday the 13th in 2020, and I thought bad things were going to happen, but we managed to get through that, and hopefully we'll get through this one too. Another great week on the show. Thank you so much for those of you that are contributing on a regular basis, and those especially feeding back afterwards. It's been interesting to have a little look. We got to 55 shows. I thought, let's have a little look at some of the stats, and it's feeling increasingly worthwhile to keep in touch with you this way and tidying up some of my social media use to be able to not just succumb to the clickbait and comments. We've been able to really engage in a few topics, which has been brilliant. Hopefully move the conversation forward. Delighted today to have a guest on. I've mentioned all week that I've been looking forward to this one. Ben Ellis is joining me to talk a little bit about conferences, the format, the utility, the purpose, the audience, something that me and him have been having conversations publicly and privately about pre-pandemic. So when we think about the way in which virtual conferences have changed that conversation, or at least added to it, felt smart for us to sort of talk that through. A question I want to ask you guys before I bring Ben on is to say what experiences you've had with regards to the virtual conferences, but mainly I want to know not whether you've been to any and stuff like that. It's more, are they suiting the purpose? You know, do you go into that caring about the purpose of them, right? You know, it's like networking, education. What is it that you're trying to engage with them for? And are they meeting those needs? Are they helping you achieve your goals, or do you just not think like that? And actually, it's something that really you just notice that sort of piques your interest, and you're not sure how. Really interested in your thoughts as we talk this through. So without further ado, let me. He says, well, it should be a couple of clicks of a button. Ben Ellis is here. Can you hear me, mate?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Good. Lovely. Well, let's get stuck in then. I want to get straight into your thoughts and feelings about conferences and how that has maybe even as it changed or cemented your views, especially in the advent of this weird year we've had.
Well, I mean, as you say, we've talked before, and I think that conferences have a really important role to play in a number of different aspects of healthcare. But I think that they are often tied to a kind of model that has really been around from like the 19th century, and this idea that the way to share scientific discovery is through bringing like the sort of eminent minds of the field together into a room, and then people present ideas and sort of there's then a scope for questioning and critiquing them from the other people in the room, and that's been going on, as I say, for like hundreds of years really. And it hasn't changed much. And so one of the questions that I guess I've had and been trying to, just look at other ways of doing things and kind of challenge some of the status quo is whether or not that is a model that's grown, as I say, out of sort of scientific conferences, whether that really suits healthcare conferences. If we're looking at conferences as a source of CPD for practicing clinicians, does that model do what it needs to do? And can conferences meet the needs of these often two sort of disparate groups of people, researchers and clinicians, maybe also educators, maybe also, more sort of policymakers. And so a conference like the Physiotherapy UK tries to meet the needs of this really vast group, and maybe what we're seeing now with some of the changes to virtual is that it's easier to get more sort of access to distinct types of CPD or conference material. So does that change anything? Does that change anything about, should we be having a different conversation now about what conferences need to look like? Has the paradigm shifted? Some of this stuff has been disrupted. It's as a kind of necessity. This isn't a thing that I was. So I'm going to keep talking. So feel free to cut in if I go on too much. But sort of, I think we probably talked before around. At the World Congress of Physical Therapy conference last year, 2019, I took the unposter to that with Michael Rose, part of the In Beta project that we run, and the poster was asking, do we need any more conferences? That was the poster. The poster was designed in a way to highlight the limitations of posters at conferences, so it didn't really have any content on it. The content was generated through conversations we had at the poster and sort of and through the poster, and move the content online. So we were trying to make points about actually in the 21st century with kind of digital communication, the range of options that we have for that now, that using conferences as your primary vehicle to transmit kind of new knowledge or information is really not a good way to think anymore. But that there's some really useful things about conferences, because you get a load of really interesting people in the same room with a shared interest at the same time, and actually being able to then facilitate the discussion. Like conferences could move more towards that. And so I guess now, having kind of made that point, I had, at that point, it was inconceivable that we'd be where we are now, a year later, with all the disruption that's happened. But it seems like this is a really good opportunity again to really push home that question and ask what the purpose is, and if once we're clear on the purpose, then how does the form and function of conference best reflect that purpose?
So you were at that point, far pre-pandemic, reflecting on the better integration of digital tools, and a more thoughtful concept of purpose as to what any given conference should be. You then would never have thought about the rush job that would need to be done to somewhat replicate and attempt to replicate. And obviously, I've been part of that virtually. That wasn't what you were thinking at that point. But has it been a positive in the fact that everyone's had to adapt that way, or has it been that because of the circumstances, meaning that it was sort of forced rather than sort of thoughtfully applied, has that meant that there's just been new errors, in your opinion, whereby people have just replicated in-person conferences as much as they can online and not really given thought to better utility of tools?
Well, I just think it's been a really interesting thing to watch and observe, and I think you can almost see the evolution happening in real time from the start of the pandemic, where we got this explosion in kind of webinars and it's quite easy to move sort of talking heads online. So you can present to PowerPoint slides and people can listen to that, and that's very easy to do over online. It's quite easy to have question and answer type things as well. The chat function actually is, I'd argue, is a good way to sort of democratize some of these things. It's much easier for more people to be able to contribute to those processes online. So we sort of saw the initial switch, so that there were some things that were already planned and had to make that switch, and they were happen to operate with the best they could with the tools available. There were some things like Therapy Live which kind of grew out of that. So there had been some plans for in person, and it was like, well, we're going to change it a bit. What can look different out of here? We obviously for our unconference for In Beta had planned a face-to-face unconference, and then had to think, well, how do we do an unconference online? And that, for those of you who might not be aware of what an unconference is, it's about, again, this sort of idea of sort of subverting and changing the hierarchy of the conference, so it's much more participant led rather than the content decided by a committee that then sort of sets out the program for people to attend. And then we've kind of moved. So there was a load of people kind of going, well, we were going to do this, now we can't. What can we do instead? And so they already had a bit of a plan, and it was thinking, how can I make this plan work now in the online space? Quite rightly. And I'd even include things like Physio UK in that, although the time lag was a bit bigger from the start of the pandemic. There was a plan. The conference format already pre-existed, and so it was about then finding the platform that allows you to do that. And I think then what is also going to be interesting to see is from this point on. So as we get into next year, I mean, do people just move back to face-to-face when they can anyway? Right. But do we start to see stuff growing out of this that now is saying, well, actually, like, we've seen the strengths and the limitations of the digital, what a digital conference might look like, and we start to innovate a little bit and change up, rather than just doing this replication, just getting the platform looking and feeling as much like the face-to-face conference as it can do. Is that the best use of, again, the sort of online, or should we be taking taking some bits that used to always happen face-to-face and shifting those online and leaving others face-to-face, and just trying to split things out a little bit more is, I think, what's going to be interesting to see. Yeah,
that integration of the two and trying to work out what the best features of each is going to be a really fascinating next take, because replication has been necessity, but has it been, have things been optimized? And we can definitely talk about some of our opinions in that direction, but also where where is it very much an obvious compromise that needs to not be then doubled down on as a new normal just for the sake of it, when we are getting back to peacetime. For those that are tuning in live, I've said before, when guests are on, you're always quieter. But the question we want to ask you and we want to get you involved in is whether or not you give any thoughts, a sense of purpose as to when you're engaging with online content or conferences, whether it be networking, for education, for just it happening to be where there's someone that you want to hear speaking. Does that matter? And if it does, then let us know whether you think it does. I said on Monday's show, I was reflecting on the fact that this Physio UK that they'd done in a virtual sort of Sims-like environment where you basically had an avatar and stuff that you drove around a virtual conference space, and was very much as much they could do a like for like, really, in a way of what they'd planned, was something that I observed with interest for various different reasons, including the fact that we'd looked at vPUK software for Therapy Live and opted against it, in part because we wanted to do a very education-rich show, including by recording content to decrease the educational waste that we were concerned about when people don't actually record and film these things and capture those moments in time, as well as trying to do it on a scale that was unheard of and couldn't be done in person. So that's one of the reasons we opted against it. But then to observe what they'd done at Physio UK, they, as close as they could, replicated their style of conference through that software, and it really did work for that. You really could have private chats and go into private rooms and sit around on a bench, and I imagine, although not a researcher, not an academic, not an educationalist, and only a bit of one hand in policy, it wasn't for me as a clinician, and therefore it's something that, in my opinion, that's how I see Physio UK conferences. And so with that said, I think it was a good replication. Now, I'm not then smuggling in the argument that that's what it should be for. I think there's an interesting argument when I think about it, being there's about 1,000 people on platform on the Friday. I think a little less on the Saturday, although I wasn't really involved as much on a Saturday. We can talk about that maybe as well. Whereas if I'd have been there in person, I'd have been there in person. Whereas instead I had a ticket of which I didn't then take up, in part because I had other things to be doing. So I think that whilst it was a good replication, it still doesn't then, it still begs the question as to whether that is the right thing to do for Physio UK, of which is the flagship of a membership of, and Alex McKenzie announced, 60,000 members. And so I'm not even going to do the quick percentages to try and work out who of them. And we don't know of the 1,000, how many were members, how many were students, how many were therapists. We don't know the distribution of it. I also argue that we didn't know the professional delineation across neuro, respiratory, pediatrics, orthopedics, sports. And so you then were in this situation where you got this program in which even at best, you were then sessions were two dozens, at best a couple of hundred, of which isn't a crime in itself, but it's something that is at least meant to be the flagship conference for bringing a profession together in this instance, or the membership body within a profession. And so that I find interesting. I definitely want to get your opinion on, but an admission from me that compared to Physio UK Normal, they used the right software, they did the right thing to like for like transmit that as best they could. And despite some technical challenges, of which there were plenty, I was impressed with that.
Yeah, so to be clear, I didn't attend. So all I can sort of talk to is sort of what I saw from the outside. And from the outside, it looked, as you described, that was probably as good as it's going to get for replicating that type of conference in the online space. Maybe until we've got like virtual reality headsets in everyone's home or something. Do you know what I mean? You might be able to get something more immersive then. But with the constraints of the technology as it exists, it looked to me like they'd picked the right platform and they'd replicated their plan. Now, the question then is as you say, is that the right plan? So the reason I didn't attend, so I would have attended if it was face to face and I had a plan for what I was going to do, but my plan got ditched when it moved online because I didn't fit into the platform. So I was going to have a different type of unposter this time. I'd got a little area that I was going to have with some blank posters, and so the idea is that these posters would be created over the course of the conference. So it was going to be led by participants who could suggest topics that they wanted answers to, and then we'd try and crowdsource answers to like the most popular topics on the posters as the conference went on. So you can see again, I'm trying to play a little bit with the idea of posters. I'm trying to use them as a source of conversation, and seeing the kind of knowledge of the crowd as being a useful thing to try and extract from a conference, rather than it just being who's the expert speaker. I see so much stuff on social media, and don't take this as a criticism, because some of it comes from you as well, about like, look at this lineup, look at the lineup, excellent lineup of speakers, and it's almost like this kind of, you like, celebrity thing about the, you know, like who's the headliners for your conference, and I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. That doesn't really fit with my understanding of what might be useful at a conference. That actually the people in the audience are as important maybe as the people on the stage, and it's about trying to sort of bring those conversations together. And I know that's something that you'd share, and I can understand the importance of having a lineup to attract people, to then get interesting people in the audience too. So it works both ways. But where was I going with that? Yeah, so the having kind of had this bit of a plan that I was going to do, then moving it online onto this platform, that something like that just didn't fit. Like the platform couldn't accommodate what I wanted to do there, and so we sort of lost that. And so that seemed like a shame. That you once you the technology is going to constrain it to some extent. You maybe don't have the flexibility that you have in a physical space to then do things and experiment a little bit. I think your point about the breadth of it as well is a good and a valid one, and I think it speaks then to what I was saying at the start about, is a conference the best format for CPD for clinicians, and is the conference there to disseminate the latest research? If we're trying to disseminate the latest research, is the latest research the research that should be informing practice? Or should research that's informing practice be like a cumulative amount of research? Once we've sort of had several data points to kind of bring together on something, rather than the kind of bleeding edge thing of like, what's the latest thing? Often that sort of cutting edge research is not the sort of thing that you want someone to go back and try and implement straight away in their clinic. And so there is this dual purpose. And I don't know. I mean, I can give you my thoughts about what I think a good way forward in there might be, if that's.
We can, and we will. I want to just make sure that, although not in a defensive or reflexive way, I want to explain a little bit about how I see it with regards to the sort of can you flip the classroom on a conference level, and especially the scale and therapy live stuff, especially with June's show is interesting, because me and you have spoken about the fact that, and we spoke on Physio Matters, for those that haven't seen that episode, me and Ben get stuck into educational theory and stuff like that, and I think it did come up in that conversation about the fact that the speed and rate in which we did it meant that we complied within fairly traditional and somewhat didactic teaching methods. However, then tried to create a platform in which you could then retrofit a community in a very engaged, especially at the scale we did. It meant that it was, I think people argue that they were actually far more engaged, even though the format wasn't as much panel and interview based, which we mixed it up a bit more. Therapy Live Sport, we had some keynotes, but we had some panel discussions, we had some interview sessions, we had some Brits of pre-record as well with athletes and patients, and so we tried to mix that up. But I think that I actually can't see that part of me would think that an instinctive argument would be, well, I have to comply within here's the big lineup in order to get bums on seats, and then you're trying to create a community feel, and then in time you won't need to do that. Admittedly, that would be a cop-out from me, because I feel like that will always be a fairly leading edge marketing thing, in part because I think that is where the headline speakers that are thought leaders that are giving a lot of their time is spent thinking in that direction as a specialist. I do not think that there is going to be a circumstance of which on that given day, in that given context, that the random Joe Blog satin audience, whilst of course they're of similar human value, don't get me wrong, they are not in that moment as important as person on stage. And therefore, it's well worth showcasing that talent, in part because we need to make sure that there is a justified, not celebrity gurus, but there is a justified reward for people specializing in that space, especially those that are volunteering their time to then share that knowledge. If we disincentivize that, we don't want it to be gurus and celebrities, I agree, and there's a way in which that gets carried away. But if we don't at least have an appropriate naming rights for them to then step up to, as well as be rewarded for the plaudits that come with that. I worry that we would then end up not having the expertise that then people are going to lean into, but also then share. So that's how I sort of see it, and it does map onto some of the ways in which I do see the world. Is we've got to sometimes use some of these things that can be pathological and we can get carried away, but we also, if we move too far away from them, I think we do lose something as well.
Sure, and you know, I mean, I totally acknowledge sort of trying to market, I guess, the kind of unconference things that we've run within beta. Like that's a really hard sell to say to people, come to this, give up 2 days of your time, particularly if it was going to be face to face, come to a different country, you know, sort accommodation, sort whatever. I can't tell you what we're going to discuss. I don't have an agenda. I've got a blank bit of paper at the minute, and we're going to set an agenda on the morning of day one, and from there, like, hopefully it will be interesting, because you know we hope that you're interested and that you're going to come with some interesting thoughts like that. The kind of level of faith you need in for that is much higher, and in some ways actually doing that online makes life easier, because as you kind of alluded to before, you don't need, the commitment is not quite so high online. It's quite easy to go, this is rubbish, I'm just going to leave and go and do something else. You know, you've not traveled all the way somewhere. Now that has downsides, because it means that the buy-in is not as high, and particularly if I'm advocating for more sort of active learning approaches and things that require the participants in the audience to give more of themselves into it, then they need to have committed some time, you know, for that to be worthwhile.
It doesn't lend itself to multitasking and it being in your phone, and I see that. I want to just check though. Do you know the kind of irony of the fact that your success, especially as it will grow, and I anticipate it will grow, will be based on the individuals probably more so than a traditional format? So one of the ways in which you're going to be able to move people to different countries may be that, yes, okay, there's not a roster or an agenda, but some people I'd like to be in that room with is actually going to be the only draw, at least within a typical and traditional model. Yes, you've got speakers naming lights, but you've also got the topic. So even if they don't recognize the name, the topic might draw. Whereas with yours, I would say that not through it as a fault, but it will end up in time being the people. And if it'd be almost near impossible to market if you weren't actually to recognize who is going to be there.
I don't know if I'd agree with that, because like, there's not any way for other participants to know who is going to be present. I guess they kind of know that I'm going to be there, and
well, they know the sense of community who are the frequent engagers within beta projects. Sure. They, you know, it's sort of that who were there last time. Sort of what I'm meaning is that I think that you'd struggle further to get people in a room if you said, not only will you not know because we can't tell you, but actually, somehow we've done a random sampling exercise of physiotherapists in the world, and it just so happens that 50 of them are going to be in this room. People will be like, I don't fancy that lottery. That's kind of what I'm getting at, is that the self-selection bias that will occur is part of its draw. And I don't think it's a criticism, by the way. I'm just meaning that it's these phenomena are just to be human, isn't it? It's not necessarily an inherent bias we need to correct for.
I completely take what you're saying, and it, you know, what you end up with is it works on a small scale, and it's niche, and you know, I couldn't even begin to think about how you'd scale that to 60,000, you know, to 20,000, whatever the Therapy Live numbers were in there. You know, like we're talking about different things. Having said that, I think again that there might be some crossover, and I'm just seeing a couple of the comments in the chat about sort of hybrid models, and you touched on this sort of flipped approach before, whereby. So let's say there is, we think more of the presentation side of a conference as being like a kind of stimulus, yeah. So that seeds some ideas, and maybe that's a good area for research to be in. So the presentation is about the research findings, you know, and we've got our experts and our thought leaders and our leading researchers doing something in a recorded fashion beforehand. And then it's about coming together, and the discussion in the room is about, well, how do I implement that? So, okay, you've told me something really interesting there about the latest research for this type of injury, or you've told me something really interesting about physio education. But how does that apply to my practice? How am I going to take that into the classroom? How am I going to take that into the clinic? Yeah. And having that's where the kind of wisdom of the crowd, I think, comes in, because people will have tried to implement various aspects of things similar to this into their practice, and being able to draw on that experience is really useful. And so this is where I think you can get to having a digital conference, which is, the initial thought, the presentations recorded, that could be live recorded, doesn't really matter. And then you get smaller groups of people in a room together, and they're sort of self-selecting. And the whole idea of the unconference is whoever turns up is the right people. If you've bothered to come, you're interested enough to be contributing to this conversation. And also maybe that goes with some of this sort of environmental and cost implications of conferences, whereby you could have a sort of hub and spoke model. So the hub is the kind of digital online conference. The spokes are that regionally you could have sort of, places where people can come together to be engaged in some of these conversations that might be happening. So you might only end up with 30 people in the room in Birmingham or Manchester, do you know what I mean? But actually, you're having a conversation around these topics at a sort of manageable scale, drawing on the local expertise that you have there. And does that make it more likely for sort of collaborations and things to come out of that? I'd suggest it possibly does too. So I think that's an interesting space where I'd like to see stuff move into.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if that's I'm going to sound like I'm just totally bandwagoning that, although funnily enough, me and you have been thinking both publicly and privately about this together, and I can't help but wholeheartedly agree on that. That's how I see it, especially in if we ever can consider the world post-pandemic, we end up in a situation where that model of integrating and optimizing the models is really important, because you can't simulate a hug, a handshake, and a beer, and some of the things, the je ne sais quoi that comes from that level of networking, especially with people with a common purpose, be that intellectually or otherwise. It's a special thing that is difficult, and we shouldn't, I think, try to double down on that virtually. However, there is a certain amount of wastage and environmental concern, and as well as then the costs that make it more of an access issue, particularly internationally. And so that for me is where the magic will happen, is if we can appropriately recognize what are optimal tools for each of the things and features that we want to try to replicate. And that's where I think that it would be remiss if we didn't learn how to best integrate them. And that's where true innovation will lie, not in the replication, wholehearted replication of a format that once worked before, but instead for that pick and choosing and trying to integrate it appropriately. It brings with it a true network effect that will need to occur. If you imagine that regionalized model of getting together face to face, potentially to absorb and then reflect on content that might be delivered centrally, that is something that will inherently mean that it decentralizes from governing committees, because you're going to need your spokes are going to need to be very involved and integrated, because that's where the magic's happening. And I like that. I do think that then further democratizes not just the participation, but also the organization, and could be, I dare say, I feel that weight on my shoulders, because we're probably well placed to do just that. And so here, you heard it here first, folks. We will be trying something like that, including some interesting and innovative ways in which posters and other innovative works can be presented, but not necessarily relying on people to follow through with traffic passing a poster. Instead, we can integrate that into workshop formats to actually create material on the day. Thanks so much for the comments coming in. I know that they will flood in after the fact as well, and please do, as many have, email over or get in touch with me on my social media. I loved this one that came in from Alistair Beverley saying it looked like a Wii Sports Resort. That's the sort of, I've kept calling it like the Sims, the virtual physio UK with these avatars and stuff. But yeah, Wii Sports Resort is a great shout as well. Many thanks, Ben, for your time as ever, mate. And this conversation will roll on. And another way for me to catch you live on air to say, I hope you will continue to help us shape the future of digital education. So I've got you on the hook. Is that a nod of your head? Yes, Jack. Of course, I'll happily chat. Yeah, that's great. Nice one. Tell people where they can find you, what's your Twitter handles, etc., and what's in beta.
At Ben.Ellis. as in DOT Ellis, on Twitter. And yeah, InBeta is a community of physio educators who do things like try and run conferences and very occasionally podcast, but probably should do it more often. Have some that still need editing to go out. But you can head to inbeta.uwc.ac.za.
Incredibly catchy URL, isn't it? I think we better post that one.
It's a good one. Yeah.
The text. We should put that in text. I've just remembered. We probably could have started this conversation in third gear if you've ever published the podcast you did with me and Steve Tolan talking about this very thing about 2 years ago. So you're a bugger for that. Talking of educational wastage, you're guilty as charged on that, mate. But you do a lot of otherwise good work. No worries. Thanks a lot for your time. Have a great weekend, and we'll speak again soon, mate.
Cheers.
Cheers, then.